And you are welcome along to a resurgent version of the Huddle Breakdown. After listening to my mother and two other people inquire repeatedly about when we're going to come back, we've decided it's time we better give an update on the future of the podcast. Appreciate everyone sticking with us as we've been in the off season and figuring things out, filling this gaping hole that Enda Coll left in our lives, not only personally, but from a production and a hosting perspective. So we're basically taking the month of August to figure out what we're doing. With my good friend Alan Morrison, Celtic by number, who's with us, obviously, and Laura Bradburn, who is joining us as, for now, we'll see, guest host. We're trialing it out. She's got to figure out whether she wants to hang out with these two idiots more than once. Welcome, Laura, guest host for the show today. I'm going to hand it off to you. We got some things maybe in the works planning for the rest of August. We're trying to figure it out, but just for today, we're here to have fun. Talk about Kilmarnock and this transfer window. What the hell's going on? I don't know. But Laura, welcome to the Huddle Breakdown.
Thank you very much. I feel like the equivalent of a trialist on the scoreboard at the moment. So you may hear from me again after today. You may not. It depends how it goes, I suppose. But pleasure to join you for today. Anyway, Alan got in touch with me a couple of weeks ago. Very Brendan a la Casper Schmeichel style, and sort of said, we need somebody at the back, can you help us out? And I says, yeah, I mean, I don't know how much use I'll be, but I'll certainly do what I can. So it's a pleasure to join you.
The official line was actually we've been in conversation and negotiation since May. That's the official line, but in reality it was 2 weeks ago.
Well, and in fairness, Alan, to let people in behind, Enda did kind of hint that he might be going to Australia back around the winter. This is a shockingly similar timeline as Joe Hart's retirement announcement. So the parallels here are eerie.
Yes. No, you guys are much more organised than the Celtic board. I'll not have you saying that.
No. Well, let's dive in then, Laura. What did you want to talk about? We're handing over the reins. Alan and I are the two dummies here, so we need someone to help us steer the ship. So, what did you have in mind?
As Maria von Trapp used to say, let's start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. I understand that is not maybe a reference that many on the Huddle Breakdown will be familiar with, but that's what you get when you hire me, I suppose. Alan, I'll come to you first. We obviously had the curtain raiser against Kilmarnock. Certainly from an eye test point of view, as I like to talk to you about, the performance seemed very pleasing without looking into too much depth. Would you agree that what you saw was something that you were encouraged by against Kilmarnock in the opening weekend?
Definitely. I mean, I'm not going to be overly churlish, but as always, we are about context. And I was kind of optimistic, right, before we started about this game, although Kilmarnock gave Celtic a lot of issues last season. And the reason being is that Kilmarnock are right bang in the middle between two games against a Belgian opposition, Cercle Bruges, and then Tromsø for a playoff to progress their European ambitions, which is clearly massively important to that club that they do so. So I was kind of optimistic. I was thinking back to the Aberdeen game last year when Aberdeen came off the back of a tough night in Europe on a Thursday, and they simply didn't have anything to match Celtic's speed and movement on the Sunday. And that was the game that Celtic won 6-0. I wasn't necessarily expecting that with the first game of the season, but I was kind of optimistic. But what sealed the deal for me was when I saw Derek McInnes's pre-match interview, and it was absolutely appalling, actually, because essentially, if you wanted to make a series of excuses for why you were about to lose the game you're about to play, that's essentially what he gave. I mean, he complained about having to play this game between all these European ties. He complained about injuries to his defenders. He complained about one of his defenders being suspended. He complained about having to shuffle his pack already and not feeling quite ready for this game and all that. And essentially, if you give professional footballers an excuse to not have to shake a leg, then that was it. And I think pretty much, that's what kind of unfurled, really. I've never seen a Kilmarnock side so lacking in energy, so lacking in. There was none of the usual McInnes man-to-man marking, none of the usual high-energy pressing, none of the usual, throwing everybody forward to get long balls into the box and all that sort of thing. We'll get into the detail. I'll just give you one stat that kind of backs that up, really. So there's an amazingly complicated stat to enunciate, which is passes per defensive action, which is a proxy for pressing. So the higher the passes per defensive action that you achieve, the less effective generally the opposition's pressing is. And Celtic achieved just over 30, about 13 and a half passes per defensive action by my calculation. Each vendor will calculate them differently, as it were. 13 and a half passes per defensive action. There's only been 5 games that I've ever recorded where the passes per defensive action has been higher, as in Celtic have managed to pass the ball unhindered more often than they did in this game. And one of those was a 7-0 home win against St Johnstone. And another one was when Ange had pretty much given up, or I think we played St Mirren at home late in May, and nobody really cared anymore. So that puts you into context for how pitiful Kilmarnock were. So I don't want to be surly. I don't want to remove the joy from what was a really good performance. But, on this show, context is everything. And that, for me, was very important context.
I mean, I think that's a fair assessment based on what we saw. To the layman's eye, it might have looked like Kilmarnock were sitting back, but as you say, there was just a lack of pressing there and a lack of urgency that they didn't seem to pick up at any point. James, are you in agreement with Alan's assessment there? If we look at Kilmarnock first of all, were you expecting more from them, or was that just about par for the course for them?
Once I saw their lineup, I felt ominous for them, cheerful for us. They had I actually didn't see that interview, so I didn't hear the excuse making, but having heard Alan's characterization of it, it makes sense given, I think he's a 19-year-old loanee from Sunderland that played left back. I'm not sure he's an actual left back. That would make sense given what McInnes said. He's pretty big for a left back. And yeah, it was kind of a hodgepodge. Didn't start Armstrong. The one thing because again, I haven't watched the game back. In watching it and then watching the highlights, it almost looked like a half-assed Derek McInnes man marking system, meaning that guys that looked tired. So they were kind of man marking, not very well. Because I thought the third goal was emblematic of that, where I think it was Stuart Finley chased Kyogo about 15 yards into our half like a lunatic, wasn't even close to him, and created that huge space and void, and then had to sprint back. And so it's that kind of fun part of playing against a Derek McInnes side, where if they're on the ball, in elite top form, and he does a good job at selecting his side and setting them up, they can be a tough physical challenge until they get tired in the 80th minute kind of thing. Like we've seen that over and over again against Derek McInnes sides. This was not that. This was like parking lots of, it looked like an Ange Celtic team against Real Madrid in the second half, only the whole game. There were parking lots of space and transition and us pinging the ball around. So now that's not to say, as Alan said, it's one of the annoying things that we like to do is to look at how the opponents actually set up and how they performed. It takes two to tango type of thing. But we got functional wing play. What the hell's going on, Alan? Two good wingers playing well in a game. What a joy that is. And having 3 midfielders and a keeper that can facilitate build up and move. It looked a lot more like a functional Celtic side, which again, coming off of the preseason qualifiers there, again, teams that weren't exactly playing intense defending in a lot of ways in those preseason matches. But yeah, so a lot to be encouraged by, but not Kilmarnock's best version, not their best iteration of Kilmarnock.
Yeah, I think that's more than fair to say. Alan, I wanted to pick up on James's point there about the functional wing play and specifically Nicholas Kuhn. We're all familiar with the fact that when he came into the club, he had those dental issues that caused him to lose a lot of weight. He was looking fatigued. He looked underweight, obviously. And then there's obviously the whole nutritional side of things that he would have struggled with at that time. That's perhaps led to a slightly harsh judgment on his abilities when he first joined. And we're certainly seeing some more encouraging signs from him, both in the pre-season and in that opening match. What have you made of his sort of development so far, and do you think there's more to come from him this season?
Hope so. I mean, I think what was encouraging was that he put in that performance, which was okay. I mean, again, I'm not damning with faint praise here. I'm actually, what's in my mind when I say that, when I say okay, is that we were once again so left side dominant that he actually didn't get a lot of the ball, right? So Forrest received the ball over and over and over again on the left side. And it's just something that since the days of really since Kieran Tierney emerged in the team, and he would be the forward focus and Lustig would slip back, is that, and probably since McGregor, given that he tends to occupy slightly left of centre rather than right of centre, is that Celtic are, and generally are in most games, very left-sided dominant. So the right winger doesn't see as much of the ball. And I think that was exacerbated a little bit by the fact that Alistair Johnson is clearly, he's finding his way back to sort of, not back to fitness. I think it's more that we need to be careful with him because his team went far in the Copa America semi-finals. He was the last one to kind of wrap up the season last season. He's only had a couple of weeks. He's not played any pre-season matches. He was in the team of the tournament, which suggests to me he's been putting everything into all these games as well. So that I think that feeds into it as well in terms of he wasn't his usual self in terms of bombing forward. We didn't see him really break the ahead of Kuhn very often. So all of those things are important. But I think despite that, I think Kuhn was effective. He's clearly got blistering pace. I was pleased that he was effective on the back of that Man City game. If it had been the case that he had a really ineffective game, for example, I think a lot of people would have gone, "Oh, he was great against Man City. It didn't matter. He's back to normal," sort of thing, and a bit of momentum I think would have been lost. But that he's put in a pretty solid performance, I'll say, on the back of that, quite sparkling counter-attacking performance against Man City. That was the thing about him that encouraged me. But as James said, there was a lot of good performances. They didn't really try man to man. It was a kind of half-arsed 4-5-1 kind of deep block. I wasn't really sure what they were trying to achieve, but the bottom line was that Hatate and O'Reilly in particular were given huge amounts of space, and they both profited massively for that, and that allowed the wingers to come into the game. Kyogo, he looked really fresh. He seems to be absolutely committed to only playing one-touch football. Like every pass was a first-time pass. Every shot pretty much is a first-time shot. So, and he did pretty well. He was allowed to come deep, and he did more join-up play than he perhaps normally has done. So, a lot of positives from it. I would say, if I had to summarise, really for me. Is a couple of things. So we're going to go on to talk about transfers, and obviously, frustration about the fact that we had 10 outfield players playing. None of them were new signings. I don't think any of the substitutes that came on were new signings either. So all the outfield players were there last year. But what I would say is, and this will probably get James's back up a little bit. I think we did see some of the value of Brendan Rodgers here, in that there's clearly progress in this team, like we saw with Ange, in becoming a stronger unit, a more cohesive unit. The connections were good, the spacing was good, all that was effective against a poor team on the day. And I think that speaks to Rodgers, and the time he's had now with those players. And I think, and this is where I'm about to veer into what some may label cognitive dissonance, in that I'm not saying that not signing new players is a good thing just because we've not signed new players. I'm not saying that, but sometimes actually not signing new players can be a good thing, in the sense of I think we undervalue sometimes the power of cohesiveness and familiarity, and players knowing how each other play. I'll give you another example. So my another team that I follow quite closely is, because it's my hometown team, is Falkirk. Now they got promoted to the Championship, and they were on telly on the Friday night opening the Scottish season at home to Queen's Park. they ran away with the League Two, League One, whatever it's called, last season. They have signed a couple of players, but they've really pretty much got the same team as they had last season, and you could tell. And they just looked like a proper football team in all respects: on the ball, off the ball, shaping, spacing, timing, when to make runs, expecting the ball, all that. And that, with putting aside the abilities of the individual players, that aspect, that team play aspect, I think is what pleased me most about the game on the weekend. Is that Celtic actually benefited in some respects, from listening to Rodgers' instructions, what he wants, but also executing it with players that you're familiar with. I'm not saying we shouldn't sign anyone, absolutely not, but it is at least a shining light in terms of there is one advantage, at least, to that sort of the power of predictability, if I can call it that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. James, we are going to get on to signings, and that is going to be the main stay of the rest of the show. But just before we do that, off the back of what Alan said about some of the outstanding performances against Kilmarnock, was there any performances you would pick out that haven't already been mentioned, or anybody that you think particularly, gave themselves a good write-up, if you want to put it that way?
I thought the most interesting performance was Kyogo, because the way he was utilized last season was kind of a tweener between the two managers. We saw flashes of games where he would drop deep and get involved and build up, but generally speaking, it went back to closer to the way he was deployed under Ange. And to Alan's point, Alan mentioned that he was dropping deep more and getting more involved, and that was reflected in the numbers. I mean, I think he averaged only something like 12 passes that he would be received per 90 minutes last season in the league, and I think he was at like 27 or 28 for this game on a per 90 basis. Now, the other thing is he usually doesn't play 90 minutes, so that was another interesting decision to make, given the score line and the fact that we functionally only have one striker on the team. So that was notable, I should say. Not sure about the decision, but so yeah, I think the way he was using it, he was just excellent. Now, again, I think that has to do with the fact that he had a lot of space and wasn't a lot of challenging going on when he was receiving those passes, plenty of room to operate. But yeah, the one touch, and I mean, he's of a quality that's just that next tier on the ball that we've, it's such a joy to watch when he's on his game like that. And he was on fire. I mean, everyone, said coming out of the game, it's unfortunate he didn't get a goal because he was so good on the day. But yeah, so not only how good he was, but the way that he was used and really given license to run rampant all over the place, which was fun to watch. Now we'll see if that persists, because again, I don't think we're going to see too many teams play that way at that level of intensity during the season, particularly on a pitch that's, manicured, untouched, the wears of a season, a little bit of rain to make it nice and fast too. So there was a lot of elements that made it so that, it was a perfect environment for him to light a game on fire. But outside of that pesky little thing of scoring a goal, he was about as dominant as you can get.
Okay, doke. I mean, I think it's I think the Kyogo performance for me was the standout, just because he seemed to be a lot more involved in the play in general. And like you say, apart from the fact he didn't score, I think he was very effective in his role. But he's certainly somebody we're going to need to get support for in the transfer window if we can. And with that, we'll move on to talking about transfers in general. Now, some people listening / watching this might think, well, what are we going to spend the next half an hour or whatever filling our time with, considering there's been very little in terms of transfers. Alan mentioned there hadn't been any new outfield players playing on Sunday. That's because at the time of recording, I believe the only new outfield player that we have is Paulo Bernardo, who signed on a permanent deal just last week. So we are awaiting potential transfer of Adam Ida. If he can get his toys back in the pram, I think that might go some way to helping matters. But the big one that everybody's talking about, and Alan, I'll come to you on this first, is Matt O'Reilly. At the time of Recording, Atalanta, we believe, have had multiple bids rejected. Brighton are now in the chase for him. I don't know if Atletico Madrid are still in the picture from January, but certainly the interest in Matt O'Reilly is high, and Celtic appear to be doing what they always said they would do, which is hold out for the value that they believe the player has to them. I guess there's two aspects to the discussion. The first one being, how likely do you think it is that he will go in this window? And the second one is obviously then, if he does, how well placed are we to replace him?
Yeah, that second one is the key question, isn't it? In terms of the first one, there's no way that O'Reilly is as Adam Ida appears to be, which is agitating for a move. He seems happy, he seems content, he seems to be enjoying his football. He's a bright guy. He's probably therefore, being well advised as well. It does appear to be that way. Matt O'Reilly has come off the back of a remarkable season, nearly 20 goals and assists, and really matured into a true all-round midfielder in the sense of, breaking into the box, scoring goals like we remember the likes of, for those my age, likes of Phil O'Donnell, and then more recently Joe Ledley, and players like that. That breaking into the box, getting on the end of things, but then the creativity of a Rogic, etc. as well, and the defensive skills. Really, as I say, he's very understated in his defending, but his positional play, knowing where to be, these great big size 12 feet that he's got, he just always seems to get a foot in. And he anticipates well because he's a very thoughtful and intelligent player. All of those things. I mean, I think if he had a wee bit more pace, we'd be looking at top 5 teams in the top 5 leagues would be looking for him basically. So I think at the moment it appears we're just teams that are interested are probably just bubbling a little bit below that. I still expect him to leave. For me, the most telling comment that's been made on all of this was by Brendan Rodgers, and it was actually last season when he spoke about O'Reilly being in the sort of asset age. He's at that asset age, peak asset age. He's 23 years old, 3 years left in his contract. He's had a massively successful season. If you are serious about being a player trading club that buys players for small fees and sells them for really big fees, now is the time to sell him. But it's not as simple as that. There has to be a demand, and there has to be, the right club. And also O'Reilly is the sort of player who isn't just going to go to a big club because they wave a check in front of him. He could have stayed at Fulham for a much larger check than he got when he went to MK Dons. He went there to play regular football. This is a guy who's not quite the usual average footballer, in all senses of the word. So I don't know how it will play out. I don't know if what is currently on the table is of interest to him. My little bits that I've received is that he's more interested in testing himself, perhaps overseas, than he is in going to England. But that may change depending on the club. So we'll have to wait and see. We're in a little bit of an unusual market. I mean, the transfer market is suppressed especially compared to last season, for many reasons. The Euros, Copa America is definitely a factor in that. I suspect that there are a lot of UEFA financial sustainability reg issues at play under the surface, and by that I mean clubs this year have to move to wages being 80% of turnover, and then next year they have to move to 70%. But you can't just go big bang with this, because contracts run over multiple seasons, as you know. So you have to plan quite carefully from a financial planning perspective what your wage bill is going to look like in year 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., to see where you sit, especially those clubs that have got European ambitions, obviously. So all of that comes into play, I think, as well. And just the general point that if you're after players that are unwanted and are in a distressed state, counterintuitively, it's easier to deal early in the market, right? Clubs are quite happy to get rid of players they don't want early in the market. It's very difficult to get players who clubs don't want to lose, either because a fee hasn't been met or because they literally don't want to sell them. That tends to go right up to the end. So there's 25 days left in the transfer window. I know I would characterize my my status as slightly concerned, but that's as far as I would go. Again, we'll come on to Celtic and how we're managing the transfer window perhaps as a separate topic, but I think because of how we're managing the transfer market, again, that has some unintended advantages in terms of where we are in the market, despite what I think is still a dysfunctional operation at the club. But to come back to O'Reilly, I think he will leave. I really do. But it will be on Celtic's terms, and it'll be on his terms, crucially, as well.
I certainly hope that that's the case for both of those, because I do like Celtic holding out for the value that they believe the player holds, because that can only hold us in good stead for the future for any players that we're lucky enough to come across that have a similar talent level. James, Alan touched on a few parts of it there. The whole financial market and the kind of staleness of the transfer market this summer in general, just because teams are having to tighten their belts, so to speak, with financial fair play and things like that, and actual consequences being delivered out to teams who don't follow that. In terms of for Celtic, what's your opinion on what damage we might do to the value of O'Reilly as a saleable asset if, for example, the offer didn't come in that we wanted? If we ended up holding on to him till January, until next summer, yes, he would still have 2 years left on his contract, but is this a case of, for you, that we can't afford not to sell him, or are we looking at a situation where actually there's enough time there that we could sort of put our foot down for this summer at least, and hold out for that big money next summer?
I agree with Alan that a serious player trading model, this is the window that he should go. And it's not that he can't have another great season, play very well in the Champions League, and we might be able to squeeze a little bit more money out of the kitty. But to Alan's point, the factors that are probably going to suppress his value probably aren't going to change. I mean, he's not going to suddenly get faster. He's probably about as peak as he's going to get in a lot of areas of the game. He might still have some development to go, but so I'd be, well, the other part of this, so I don't think we would damage his value. The risk there is always one of injury, by the way. I mean, he could do his ACL and then, then we're all sitting here going, oh, not only do we have to worry about his value next summer, we also lose a season, which would be like the worst scenario. So there's always that risk of major injury. But I think the bigger issue here is one of having the culture at the club of partnership with developing young talent. And I'm surmising, this is me speculating, but given the way that he did have a bit of a dip in form after the January window closed, well-reported interest at, I think it was 20 million by Atletico Madrid. That would be the type of thing that would turn the head of a guy who's got his kind of competitive constitution, ability, the way he's managed his career. And so it would only be logical that, a little deflating maybe, that would be the human response that he didn't go. And I could see the manager and the club say, listen, give us until the summer and then we'll take care of you. Right. And that would fit with him busting his ass in preseason. Like he's all in, because I suspect it's because there's an agreement that he's going to go this window. And, so if I'm in his shoes, that's different with guys like McGregor or, people that come up and bleed green and white, that are of the club. I mean, this is like, this is why I said the same thing when Ange talked about, what's his face? The right back that left. I still have COVID brain after all this. Juranovic. When Juranovic was leaving, and Postecoglou was like, "Well, yeah, he's a career guy. He's ambitious, and he wants to make more money and all this stuff." And that's when I said, "Yep, that's Ange gone. He won't be around much longer." That was kind of context of where he's at in his career, and it's the same thing with a guy like O'Reilly. I mean, he should want to move on here. I mean, I'm not sure what else he's going to accomplish at Celtic from a pure selfish ambition. Now, do I want him to go? Of course not as a supporter. But from a running of the club perspective, the win-win here. Now that this is the hard part, is that the most important element as a supporter is, okay, what's the after O'Reilly period look like? What's the squad composition, and how are the resources allocated and all that? That's a whole different conversation. But specifically, as far as having him move on, I think it's in everyone's interest, and quite frankly, longer term, we should want this to be a success. I mean, that we haven't had a lot of great successes since Virgil van Dijk, as far as guys leaving and lighting the world on fire. We've made some good money on Tierney. Unfortunately, injuries, I think, have been a major problem there. It's not that he's been a bad player, but he just hasn't been able, and he wasn't a great profile for the manager that he went to at Arsenal ultimately. But Jota's gone into career graveyard, enjoying 300 grand a week or whatever it's rumored to be. Which is why he's not coming back to Celtic, by the way. Forget about the transfer fee. Who's going to pay that wage? But it would be good if he goes on and has a really good next step in his career, like Frimpong. Frimpong would be the next one, but again, we didn't get anywhere near the value that we should have gotten for Frimpong. So yeah, I don't think it really serves his career to stay at Celtic another season. And I suspect it's kind of agreed upon generally that he's going to be gone by the end of the month.
Yeah, I'm just living in that dream world where he maybe just decides that he loves Celtic more than he loves the other green stuff that we all have to live by from time to time. But I do think. Well,
and in fairness to him, I would take it even above and beyond the money part, that's the obvious. I mean, it's to go make 80 grand a week or whatever, triple, quadruple his wages, life changing and multi-generational changing money. But I see him as the type of person that wants to, test himself and progress his career from a competitive standpoint. And that he just can't do that at Celtic. I mean, he's functionally got, at the max, probably 16 tough games this season if he stays at Celtic. If as a true competitor who wants to really advance and put themselves to the test, that's the level that he probably thinks he should be playing at. 30% of your games being against the level that you want to be playing at, I think is probably not sustainable for any length of time.
Yeah, and there's a question just to close out the Matt O'Reilly conversation that I wanted to ask both of you. Alan, I'll come to you first on this one. I saw some pretty horrendous suggestions on Twitter, really? not the usual ones that we would think of, but some other ones football related. Suggestions that Paulo Bernardo is seen as the heir apparent for Matt O'Reilly, and we already have him as the replacement in the squad. That there is no intention to replace O'Reilly with a player who's going to go in above the standard of Bernardo or anybody else that we've got there. Do you think Paulo Bernardo is the heir apparent for Matt O'Reilly, or do you think we are hopefully setting our sights a little bit higher than that?
Very different player. I mean, he I've written extensively about the good and bad or the good and not things to develop as far as Bernardo is concerned. They're just very different players. I see. If he is seen as that direct replacement, I would be mildly astonished. I guess. I think the wider issue is that we've got a stock full of central midfielders, and one of the failings so far of the transfer window has been our inability to shift out players that probably need to move on really and free up space. And I think when that happens, then you probably start to see some more movement on the other side, because we can't just continually accrue players and have a bigger and bigger first team squad and a bigger and bigger wage bill. We just can't do that.
You don't want to go to 50 players, Alan? Come on, let's go. Let's go to 50 players.
When I'm playing, when I'm playing Championship Manager, yeah, absolutely, but not in the real world, sadly. So no, short answer, no. I don't see him as a direct replacement stylistically, or really what Celtic should be aiming for. I mean, Bernardo, let's be honest, is I'm not going to call him a project because that's such a loaded term, and it's not what I mean. But let's be honest here. He was a squad player last season. He was generally a substitute, and he filled in because of injury, mainly to Hatate. So, he wasn't like a Jota or a Carter Vickers that came in, owned the position, and was clearly the best player in that position. And Celtic need to be replacing the likes of O'Reilly with somebody who's clearly the best player in that position if they want to do a genuine like for like. Now, that could be a young player who maybe has got a little bit of a little bit of growth to get there type of thing, but should at least have the potential to do that. So I'm not sure that's Bernardo. No, I'm not saying that Bernardo. We shouldn't be buying him given the cost, the wages, where he's come from. If we don't think he can be a first team regular, but not performing the same role as Matt O'Reilly, I wouldn't say.
Yeah, are you much the same? You were nodding along there, James. That I thought you were pretty much in agreement with what Alan was saying there.
Yeah, I think he would have to do leaps and bounds of development and show things that have just been completely absent from the way he plays. He's such a different animal than O'Reilly, just spatially in the way he progresses the ball and involved in build up. I mean, it's just, there's no comparison. And that was O'Reilly at his prior clubs, right? So there was plenty of evidence. Al and I were big fans of his signing from the start because the evidence was clearly there, and Bernardo doesn't have that. And in his relatively short time at Celtic, he's been an outlier as far as how little he does in those ways in midfield. Meaning that you saw the game on the weekend where Hatate and O'Reilly are like swirling around with McGregor and this build up and the movement and receiving passes and moving the ball along quickly. I mean, that's just, and progressing it. That's just not Bernardo's game. So maybe he can progress, but him developing would be going from really, really deficient in that area to serviceable. Whereas O'Reilly's operating at a very high level kind of across the board, which is why, it's why he's O'Reilly, and that's why he's probably on the way out for huge money. And that's also why we probably were able to get Bernardo at a cut rate deal. Let's be honest. I mean, given his pedigree, the fact that we were able to negotiate down a large amount, speaks to probably where his market was at as far as demand for a player of that pedigree, being able to get him for that price after a season at Celtic, playing in the Champions League, and serviceably. Like, he didn't have a bad Champions League necessarily. He was all right, but yes, I actually I see him as a good floor player. I mean, he's got positives to him, and that he'll raise the overall level of the team as a squad midfielder. But and you maybe have the theoretical upside, and that's okay at 3 million or 3.5 million. But we should be aiming much higher, I think, for that kind of lockdown starter. Just generally, whether it's a replacement for O'Reilly or broadly speaking in midfield.
Yes, I certainly hope Bernardo appears to. We're sitting here in a year's time talking about how much of a bargain he is, and maybe talking about moving him on for big money. That seems to be the model that we're following. James, I'll come back to you first on this last topic just before we close out the show. We've talked about O'Reilly specifically in terms of transfers. I think we all know the kind of areas that we need to improve on as a squad, but in terms of the way in which we've gone about transfers, or the lack of way in which we've gone about transfers this summer, what is your impression of the way we're doing business, basically? I mean, I hate to think that everything's as quiet and as lacking in action as it appears to be. Do you think, am I being an entitled Celtic supporter, an impatient Celtic supporter, the fact that we haven't seen any outfield players except for Bernardo, and it's now, the 6th of August?
I think given the pattern of, I'll call it collective trauma we've all experienced over the last few windows, that it'd kind of be crazy if we weren't all conditioned to expect this to end horribly in 3 weeks or whatever it is, 4 weeks away. I still think that's the less likely scenario, meaning that I cannot imagine that will completely wet the bed like we did in the last two windows for the most part. I mean, if it comes down to like if Schmeichel gets done at the last minute like Ida did in January, like that would be I would consider kind of a wetting the bed level, like a Hail Mary. Rodgers is panicking at the last minute trying to bring somebody in. So I suspect some of the dynamics that Alan referenced as far as the industry wide, and I think that the broader support, understandably, don't have kind of an accurate frame as far as what's going on financially and how impactful these FSR regulations are, and not only what's going on in the league, but what it means for Celtic. I mean, we see all this money in the bank and we say, why can't we spend it and bring in, these 8-10 million pound players and bring the wage bill up? And that, the last couple of seasons are relatively aberrational for two big reasons. One is the coefficient, and that's going bye-bye, and that's the vast majority of it is because of a reason none of us want to talk about, which is that Rangers had a couple of big runs in Europe. Without that, we probably don't have Champions League the last couple of seasons, or it would have been a lot tougher to qualify. It certainly wouldn't have been automatic. And then a completely ridiculous offer for one summer that the Saudi clubs decided to be insane and throw money at all kinds of players. And we just happened to get a huge chunk of that relative to a player who was really good at Celtic, but, not a 25 million player or a 300 grand a week type of player. So that's a huge amount of money that came into the club that probably isn't persistent, meaning that we really are, and the board has talked about this, they're operating as a Europa League club financially. And if you look at our ratios like that, our wage bill, if we go back into the Europa League next season, even if we win our league and then, get knocked out in a Champions League qualifier, which again, wouldn't be crazy. Like if you're a prudent person running the club, you can't really budget assuming that our coefficient's going to recover back and we're going to get automatic Champions League qualifier. So, or that we're going to constantly get 25 million or 50 million pound windows in sales. So, keeping that wage bill kind of where it is now, and this goes back to being smart about it and having this huge amount of players that are basically useless from a wage bill perspective. All this dead money that we lug around on players that really aren't offering anything on the pitch. So it's that issue of resource utilization and being smart about it. And you have to clear some of this out. And how do you do that when you've overpaid for people that can't find that wage in another club? So you got to eat those losses. And that's probably been my most critical part of the way that it's been run, is that, this comes back to my financial markets background, right? The worst thing you can do in financial markets is to carry a loser, because you're down. Like, let's say you buy something at 20 and it goes to 18 and you realize you screwed up buying it at 20 and it's actually a piece of crap that you should have never bought. But I'm going to wait until it goes back and I make my money back. And then it goes to 15 and then it goes to 10. And you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? Right? You cut your loss. As soon as you realize that you screwed up, you cut your loss. And I think we need to do a better job of eating the loss on some of these players. You're not going to be able to buy them out, get them off the wage bill, dump them. And I don't mean that in an inhumane way. I'm just saying that if you need to buy out their contract to a degree to move them on, to create the space because you want to be prudent and have an X amount on the wage bill, that's all reasonable. But you can't be having Liam Shaw still on the wage bill remember that guy? And I think rumored maybe James McCarthy finally got bought out. I mean, the list here of players that are just taking up space, and that's what's clogging it up, I think, is that you've got this inventory of wage bill and players, and there's all this other stuff. I agree. I mean, Alan and I have talked about this endlessly about structural stuff. The recruitment department and the sophistication there and how they're identifying targets, but it can't be this bad. Like it's been so pathetic over the last year. Like they almost have to accidentally get better. I mean, it almost takes hard work to be as bad as they've been in the last couple of windows. So that, it's not high hurdle to have aspiration. So I think we'll, bring in, 2 or 3 or maybe 4 pretty good players. And I felt that way last season too. So caveat, I couldn't imagine that they would get to the end of the last window. But I talked about it in December that there was kind of a civil war forming internally, and I expected either Rodgers to win or the Mark Lawwell camp. But we know who won that, and so now it's just a matter of waiting for some of those targets to come in, and I do think they will be there. It's just people don't like to hear it, but this is why they have deadlines, right? A lot of these deals don't get done because people work off of self-interest and incentives, and those things have to align. And like the Adamita situation, why would Norwich sell him to us right now at the price we want to pay? Why would they do that? Why would we sell O'Reilly? He's on a long-term contract, right? This works both ways. So in our fan mind, it'd be like, well, we should always get guys in right away and screw all the other clubs' interests and screw all the other players' interests and the agents and everyone else. Only our interests matter. Well, that's not how the real world works. So that's why these things tend not to get done until the last couple of weeks, is when all this stuff kind of lines up. So I think still, I'm like a Stockholm syndrome here. I think this window looks like things are lining up that will get better as far as the performance of the window. But I get why the skepticism there, the frustrations there, the conditioning's there. Had we not had this kind of internal shakeup, I'd probably be a lot more paranoid about how it could turn into a big mess by the end of the month. But I suspect, Rodgers is going to push some things through. Now that there's a separate conversation about whether that's a good thing or not. I suspect it isn't long term, but like I said, it's going to be difficult to be worse than we've been.
Alan, I'm just sitting here thinking it might have been a good thing for my general outlook on life if I'd been in the Huddle Breakdown before now, because don't hold on to a loser is some advice that I could have worked with a long time ago and numerous times, but the less said about that, the better.
We're getting personal
Alan,
here.
I suppose... well, I'm nothing if not honest. But what I wanted to pick up on what James said there and kind of look at the flip side of it is, we're all desperate for these fresh new signings. That's the excitement. I take on board the need to offload some of the dead wood, which seems to be a major sticking point for us. But, we could be sitting here with that apparently brilliant transfer window that we had a few years ago, with that lineup of Diego Laxalt, David Turnbull, Albion Ayeti, Barkas. I'm not sure if there was anybody else, but that's a lineup enough to haunt anybody's dreams. There's probably a sensible discussion to be had around not just buying for the sake of buying and making sure that the quality we bring in is actually the necessary quality that we need.
Well, absolutely, and this all comes from you can get lucky, and I think, as James says, we got lucky under Ange but listen, this happens with every manager. When a manager comes in, they've generally already got a list that they bring with them of players who they happen to personally know or happen to know because they've played against them, and they know the agent and they know what their contract situation is and all that information. Right? We saw it with Lennon. Lennon quickly brought in a number of players. I'm going back to the sort of Gary Hooper, Ledley type transfer window. We saw it under with Brendan, with Toure and Sinclair. We saw it with Ange, with all the Japanese players, etc. And we haven't seen it yet with Rodgers, other than Ida, arguably. And so I think, to pick up on James's point, if the worst that happens is that Rodgers gets to implement his list, then that's probably okay. But I'm still really, really nervous about all of this, because I can only, I can only follow the evidence, right? And if the evidence changes, I'll change my mind. No problem with that, right? So, and to that point, I'm firmly of the view, Lowell Ball is dead, right? so much rubbish written online about, Peter Lawwell's still in the building, it's Lowell ball, etc., etc. He's behind all this, stopping players. Absolute rubbish. But the situation may not be any better. That's my concern. And the reason for that is, moving from one bad model to another. Okay, so if the situation is, and again, I'm only following the evidence and joining the dots, that we've moved to Brendan Rodgers personally leading the recruitment efforts. And as I say, let's look at the left back situation. The two left backs that we've been looking at are on loan, Bueno and Beck. Well, they were on an old list, so we seem to have a combination of Brendan Rodgers and who he wants, and then old lists that haven't been refreshed. So what the frick is the recruitment team and the scouting team doing, right? And that left back situation is a nice little case study in some of the concerns that I have. My understanding is, all the effort was going to go into Kieran Tierney. There was no chatter about any other left back apart from Kieran Tierney, and his injury completely scuppered that, right? I believe he's still Rodgers' number one because he's a player that he knows, and Taylor's there without a contract. It runs out into next year. He'll be 27. That he's got to think about his future, and we're looking at possibly one or two loan players that we're picking up from an old list. The striker situation, we're back for Ida. Well, Ida's somebody that Rodgers wanted. We had him on loan last season. The only player that we've signed is Bernardo, outfield. He was here last season. Rodgers wanted him. That's fine. Schmeichel, Rodgers knows him very, very well, right? The only two little bits of, if I can call it, evidence that we're outside of, it's on Brendan Rodgers' list, or it's an old list that the recruitment department have come up with, is, I think it was really smart to get the young goalkeeper, Sinisalo, for 1 million. I think that's a really smart piece of business. That and Schmeichel together, I think that's a really, really smart. We're sorting the goalkeeping department out, hopefully for a few years now. Because I think Schmeichel's a terrific goalkeeper. Don't worry about his age. He is a top keeper. And then we've got a really good understudy. So that's been good. And then, there's a lot of chatter about the lad from Antwerp, to Balakwisha. He's about the only one that I can see that's outside of the model, bunny ears, quotes, the model that we seem to be implemented. So what I'm saying is, we all hated Lowell ball. We all saw the downsides to that. And by the way, there were upsides. The upsides was that Peter Lowell was very good at getting rid of players. He was very good at selling players, even the ones, including the ones that were kind of dead weight. We're not even seeing that now. But I just fear that we've moved from one very poor model to another, and there remains little evidence that we have a strategically driven, coherent, robust, and by robust I mean will perform excellently, whoever the manager is, recruitment and scouting operation. I don't see the evidence of that. Now, we might get away with, because of the absolute shambles of the delinquent club across the river, and because of the fact that, as I say, this is probably Rodgers' one shot to get his list in. Fine, that's like that. That's fine. If it's another Sinclair level or another, whatever, that's fine. But I just think longer term, medium to longer term, we don't have that fully functioning recruitment and scouting operation, and that remains a huge concern.
And on that positive note, I will I'll hand back over to James to close out the show. Just from a personal point of view, I want to say thank you guys for having me on the show. Hopefully, I don't do a James McCarthy and you never see or hear from me again. But it's been an absolute pleasure to get involved in the discussion and set up the season. James, I'll hand over to you.
No, thank you, Laura. Thank you for joining us. And I just wanted to plug your podcast, Thoughts on the Hoops. We encourage any of our listeners who haven't sampled the content that you're putting out to certainly do that. Appreciate you taking the time. We're going to be back next week. Because we're flying by the seat of our pants, we're trying to figure all this stuff out. I have nothing to promise you as far as who's even going to be on the show or what we're going to talk about. Poor Enda Coll off, swimming with great white sharks and fighting different poisonous organisms that live in that weird place as Australia. But he's left us orphaned here and trying to figure this stuff out. So we're still working through it, but we appreciate everyone coming back and returning with us for the new season. And come hell or high water, we'll be back next week for doing something. So thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you, Laura.